As my oldest daughter, Molly, hit kindergarten age, I felt like, okay, now I need to get serious. So I started researching all of these curriculum choices, and they were going to be fun, and they were going to be engaging and hands-on and all of that. And as I was kind of finalizing curriculum choices, out of nowhere, she taught herself how to read.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of Learning by Living, the podcast about people who learn outside of conventional school. Our guest today is Kerry McDonald, a journalist and the author of the book Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom. She's also the Senior Education Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education. For the purposes of today's show, however, she's a parent of 4 children who learn outside of conventional school. Kevin and I sat down with Kerry today to talk about what led her family to unschooling, how her children learn various things, and the benefits of unschooling. It was a fascinating discussion, so we hope you enjoy our interview with Kerry McDonald. Hey everyone. Hi, Kerry.
Hi, Gina. Hi, Kevin. So
happy you're here. Hi,
Yeah.
Kevin.
Good to see you all.
So today, I always want people to define themselves. So Kerry, if you were to introduce yourself, how would you do it?
Sure. So I'm Kerry McDonald. I'm a Senior Education Fellow at the Foundation for Economic Education, an adjunct scholar at the Cato Institute, a frequent Forbes contributor on innovative K-12 learning models, and most recently, the author of Unschooled, Raising Curious, Well-Educated Children Outside the Conventional Classroom, that was published in May by Chicago Review Press.
Congrats. That's so cool. I haven't read your book yet. I am writing a book, and so I've saved your book until after I have written my research-based book, and then I get to jump into yours. It's going to be my holiday reading, which I'm super excited about. So tell me about Kerry the parent and Kerry the unschooler or unschooling parent.
Right. So I have 4 children. I live in Boston, Massachusetts. My children have never been to school. They are 13, 10, 8, and 5. And I really became interested in alternatives to school and alternative education models back in college. I was an economics major as an undergrad, but did some work in education and took some classes and had an opportunity to dig deeper into kind of alternative education models. And that at that time, I was able to shadow that semester in college a homeschooling family that lived nearby. And I didn't know anything about homeschooling. This was a relatively new phenomenon at the time. This is the late 1990s. At the time, there were only about 850,000 homeschoolers nationwide. It was 1999 was the first year that the Department of Education tracked homeschoolers. So it's still not the mainstream option that it has become, but I really became enchanted that semester seeing an entirely new way that young people could learn without schooling, because it was so different, again, from my experience in K-12 public schooling, that I couldn't imagine that there was really another way to learn. And so that shifted my whole view. And also at that same time, I was doing a student teaching practicum in a local public elementary school. And so it really came to light even more fully for me in seeing the vastly different ways that young people were able to learn, and really feeling like not just alternative schools, but alternatives to school were really the way to go. And so that triggered my ongoing interest. I went to graduate school in education policy at Harvard and became increasingly interested in education choice and educational freedom. And then when I had my own children, about a decade after, doing this original research, I was looking around for different options for my children. And my older daughter, when she was about 2.5, my older son was about 6 months old at the time. And I remember that a lot of my daughter's same age peers were heading off to local preschools. And so I would, when we were at the library or the playground during the day, I'd have, kind of complete strangers come up to me and say, "Oh, how old's your daughter?" And I'd say, "She's 2.5. And they'd say, "Oh, where does she go to school?" And I'd say, "No, she doesn't." 2.5. But it was really this default. I think particularly, in the city where I was, it was the sense that, okay, 2.5 or 2.9 actually was the time that you were able to head off to both public and private school options here, preschool options. And so at that time, and so then people would say, oh, so you're homeschooling.
Mm-hmm.
And I would say, no, my daughter's 2.5. But homeschooling, of course, had always been in the back of my mind since that, early exposure to it. And so when this happened, I really had an opportunity. I'm so grateful because I had an opportunity to explore what the homeschooling environment was like. And I found that really in just a short period of time, the homeschooling population had doubled. So it had doubled to, or more than doubled to about 1.8 million homeschoolers by 2012. Mm-hmm. And with that tremendous growth in the homeschooling population came remarkable diversity in terms of socioeconomic diversity, demographic diversity, and ideological diversity. So in 2012, for example, it was the first time that religious motivations weren't the top driver for homeschooling families. It was actually concern about the environment of other schools, again, according to national data. And then I was able to really connect with my local homeschooling community, and it felt like such a great way to let my children learn without schooling. And as I write in the book, I really felt like if I had sent them to school, their world would have contracted. Right? Because here we were kind of immersed in the people, places, and things around us authentically, getting exposure to all sorts of different opportunities. And I really felt like that whole experience would contract. And so made the decision, not to send them to school. And then ultimately, as I'm sure from many homeschooling family stories, found my way to self-directed education. Which was really interesting, and I can just kind of go briefly into it without monopolizing our discussion. But so we kind of went along with homeschooling, knew we weren't going to put the kids into school. But as my oldest daughter, Molly, hit kindergarten age, so kind of coming up on when she would be otherwise heading to kindergarten, I felt like, okay, now I need to get serious. Like all this fun and games when she was little. That might have been nice, when you're in preschool, but now that you're 5, we have to buckle down and get serious. So I started researching all of these curriculum choices, and they were going to be fun, and they were going to be engaging and hands-on and all of that, but they would still, have definite objectives for reading, writing, and arithmetic that my kindergartner should know. And as I was kind of finalizing curriculum choices, out of nowhere, she taught herself how to read. And I thought, this is interesting. I'm about to spend all of this money on curriculum to teach my child something that she is already doing, from, of course, being surrounded by literacy. And that made me pause and wonder, is there such a thing as non-curriculum-based homeschooling? Which of course is unschooling. And then I just kind of threw myself into all of that.
You mentioned your daughter learned to read, what it sounds like more or less on her own. And I know that a lot of folks outside of self-directed learning spaces, when they hear that, it's really surprising. So as best you can tell, do you have any insight into how she did it? Did she kind of do it on her own? Did she ask for help? How did she learn these things?
Right. Well, and I can attest that it's not a fluke, because now I have my 4 kids. My 5-year-old is already reading, the early readers and things. So I can give different experiences for all of them, and they really were different, but also very similar in that the whole premise of unschooling really is allowing interests to drive learning, but also really supporting those interests. So there's a real important role for adults, as you of course know, in unschooling spaces and self-directed spaces. So it's surrounding young people with literacy, reading to them a lot, taking them to the library, but then also giving them the freedom to choose, right? What do you want to learn? What do you want to read? And allowing them to do that. And so my daughter and I sort of joke, half joking, but in truth, it was actually sort of the reality was that I'm sure many of your listeners know those fairy books by Daisy Meadows. There are probably hundreds of them now. And my daughter would just want me to read them over and over. And they're very sweet in that they're chapter books, but early reader chapter books that are very simple and have kind of the same theme every book. With only moderate differences. So there's that repetition piece. And at one point I just said, I'm really I'm really done reading these books. And so then she actually read them, it was a little bit more, she would read a few sentences and I would read, and then she would read a page and I would read a page. And then I was just like, I'm kind of done. And then if she kept wanting to read them. So she kept reading them. But it was that type of thing. With my older son, who's 10, his approach or his path to reading was similar and yet also different. So his early exposure to reading, he loved the Mo Willems Piggy and Gerald books that you probably know. But then as he got into, what was next, he wasn't interested in these kinds of fairy books or the boy, young boy equivalents. And so it was a little bit trickier for him, but we discovered that he really was interested in music. And so would listen to music and then want to know what they were saying. And so we would print out the lyrics to some of his favorite songs. And these were like rock and roll songs. And then he would read along as he was listening. So that was one thing. And then he also really got interested in technology and was interested in reading like user manuals for different technology that he was getting. So he took this kind of different path, again, that was really focused on his own interests. And then my younger daughter, who's 8, again, it was focused on what was she interested in. She loves insects and animals and, anything to do with nature. And so she really was able to learn through kind of going through that experience.
Yeah, I think that's so interesting, right? Because we always talk about unschooling being really driven by interests and intrinsic motivations and likes and strengths and all of those things, which is like, I think, the best part of this type of education. So I have a question regarding challenges. So we know, and and I know how incredible unschooling can be in terms of just the learning part of it and the academic part of it. But have you as a mom experienced any challenges, either within yourself or in your kids or from others, that you've had to overcome in this experience?
Well, I would say that our biggest challenge, and I think I speak for a lot of homeschooling families, is logistics, with 4 unschooled children who have different interests, and we're trying to connect those interests to available resources. And we're lucky we live in the city, so things aren't too far, but we still have to find ourselves kind of shuttling from one thing to another several times during the day. So it's more of a logistical challenge, but I think, nothing that other busy families wouldn't also encounter, whether they're going to school and then after school programs and appointments and so on. So I would find that to be the biggest challenge. I think the other piece, might be making sure that all of your children's needs are met, that they have those opportunities to express their interests. And we're lucky, we can get into it a little bit more, but we're lucky here that my 3 older kids attend a self-directed learning center a couple of days a week that they walk to, that is just about a mile from our house. And that gives them an opportunity to explore other interests with a whole group of kids and different adult facilitators. And it's, again, this self-directed, non-coercive space. So classes are offered. They are developed with the kids kind of deciding what various classes they want offered in every 8-week period. But they're all optional. So you always have the ability to opt out, to try one and then not to do it, or not to do any at all. And often my kids will just go to the park for the entire 6 hours of the day. And they also have kind of this open hangout place where, again, if you don't want to do any of the classes or don't want to go off to the park, you can just see what happens in sort of this organic space, build a fort, or sit and read in a corner, or play a board game with someone, or create a play with a group of kids. So it's a much more emergent kind of a space. And so, we feel really grateful that that's so close to us and so tied to our whole philosophy of education.
Yeah. I've always wondered, so self-directed learning spaces are sprouting up, right? They've been inherently popular within the last couple of years. But I live in suburban New York, And in suburban New York, I mean, there are things in the works, but they are not there. And so I am most interested in how you found this space or who created this space. And it's obvious that your kids are thriving within this space along with the unschooling.
Right. So again, we're lucky that we live in Boston, and we have a handful of these self-directed learning spaces kind of in the greater Boston area. Not, it would probably be close geographically, but not necessarily realistically given, traffic patterns and so on. But we are lucky that in urban spaces, these kinds of self-directed opportunities are really sprouting. So just a little bit of background. So one of the first self-directed learning centers was North Star Self-Directed Learning for Teens, that was founded in 1996 by Ken Danford out in Western Massachusetts. And he was a former public middle school history teacher, social studies teacher, who was really looking for an alternative, was getting a bit frustrated with what he was seeing in school and wanted to create an alternative. And he had an opportunity to read Grace Llewellyn's fabulous book, The Teenage Liberation Handbook. And that opened his eyes to this whole idea of homeschooling, and particularly homeschooling as a mechanism to launch alternatives to school and education and innovation more broadly. And so then he opened North Star, which then became a real springboard for other entrepreneurial educators who wanted to open similar types of learning centers around the country. And in fact, he launched an organization called Liberated Learners in, I think it was 2013, that really helps other interested educators to launch a similar type of North Star learning model. And so the learning center that my children attend isn't one of those sort of specific North Star models, but certainly influenced by that. And that was what triggered the educators who run my children's learning center, was what triggered their interest in this alternative. And they were certainly inspired by Ken and his work and visited quite a bit and were really friendly with him. But a little bit different with the learning center my kids go to, the founders were really inspired by the makerspace movement. And that was kind of their background. One of the founders went to MIT and really became involved in kind of tinkering and hacking and taking things apart and putting things together and figuring out how things work. And they were running a summer camp for kids that were really focused around this kind of hackerspace model. And it was this intersection of hacker spaces or maker spaces and free schools. They had some experience in these kind of democratic free school spaces. And so they were running a popular summer camp for several summers based on that model. And a group of parents about 11 years ago, it's been in existence, a group of parents approached them and said, if you do this as a full-time, school option or a school alternative option during the school year, we'll pull our kids out of school and send them there. And so they did. And then since then, it's been going now as an alternative to school. It's called Parts and Crafts, just outside of Boston. So now for 11 years, and they also do after-school programs and summer camps and so on.
I love that it was influenced by the makerspace movement. I think that's really something you don't hear all the time. I want to talk logistics because you are a mom of 4 and you are a hugely popular and busy person in terms of all the things that you're doing in writing and journalism and all the things that you do. So I always want to know, how do people do it? How do people work and unschool? And, of course, self-directed learning spaces are wonderful adjuncts to what we're doing, but how do you do it all is what I really want to know.
Well, I can only speak from my own experience. I think everyone's circumstances are different. I'm fortunate that my husband is very supportive and also has a very flexible work schedule so that we're both able to work part-time flexibly, which makes a huge difference. I think, we also have family members nearby that help, and we leverage where we can. So we, have a cleaning person help out and sometimes have our groceries delivered and those kinds of things so that we can work around the edges of making sure we're focusing on family and some of these other priorities. But, it's interesting too. I mean, I've written before about how entrepreneurship and homeschooling go well together because being entrepreneurial enables you to have a little bit more flexibility and often to work from home. And then another key piece, I think, and others have written more eloquently about it than I, but is separating this idea of kind of education and custodial care or babysitting. And so, that you don't necessarily have to do it all of the time, that you can rely on either paid babysitters or family members or, a neighbor or something like that to help out, if you need to get things done too.
Yeah, I love the cooperative sense I'm getting from what you do. I also love the sort of like we make time for our priorities, right? I remember people always asking me, I was a single parent when I first started unschooling my son, and I was a single mom and I was working and I was going to school, and people would always ask like, well, how did you do that? Like, how did you logistically do it? And it was, I don't know the real answer to that, right? You balance things and you make room for priorities and you really think like, what are my core values here and what am I doing here? And what's going to make the most impact in this person's life or my children's lives and things like that.
Yeah, and I'd also just add too that it's also, relatively recently that I've been scaling up my work. So when my kids were really little, there was no way that I could do anything except keep a mom blog, which I did for a number of years, which actually was what got me into, kind of reflecting and writing more generally. But there was no way when they were so tiny or, I had a nursing infant that I could really have done this. And so I think that's the other piece to keep in mind, that there's always a time that it doesn't, necessarily all have to be done at that moment. And as the kids get bigger and more self-sufficient and are able to get themselves to different places or attend one of these learning centers or other kinds of classes, then that frees up parents to be able to have, some more opportunities for their own self-expression.
I think it was also an important point to mention that we tend to separate education from like childcare and other things. So I have to carve out time for education as distinct from all the other stuff. And I guess in the unschooling self-directed space, education and other stuff aren't really separate. That makes a difference in how people think about it. Because I think a lot of folks, the fear is I have to carve out educational time as separate from all the other stuff.
Right. And so in this way, it's just carving out, if you use babysitters or you use family care, or some of those other things, is that, feeling like you can leverage where you can and still be, focused on your own priorities.
I did have a question about, because it occurs to me you have 4 children who are fairly different in age from your youngest to your oldest. Is there any sort of differences in kind of what you see the younger versus the older kids doing in terms of spending their time or how they learn? Because I know developmental psychologists like to kind of separate the younger kids from older kids. So younger kids, they say, do more what we call exploratory learning, which is everything is interesting. And then older kids, it's more mastery learning, where it's more focused, more intense focus on like one particular thing. Does that ring true in your experience?
Well, I mean, I think it's probably more of a birth order thing. Yeah. I mean, I think that the younger one is much more influenced by his, older siblings. He's certainly, when they're, he watches Star Wars, which I can't even imagine, when my oldest was 5, that she would be watching Star Wars and some of these other things are, but I mean, then it's just the impact of having older siblings and being comfortable with kind of older environments. But yeah, the learning center that the 3 older ones attend is multi-age. So it's, there's so much value, I think, in that kind of multi-age learning setting, again, whether it's in your home or in one of these self-directed spaces where the older kids really take on that leadership role and that nurturing role and bring in the younger kids, and then the younger kids learn from that. And it really helps to regulate everyone's behaviors and make it a much more collaborative space. So my kids really don't have a sense of like age segregation, like that you would only go to school with other 13-year-olds or other 10-year-olds, which again, of course I'm speaking to the choir here, but when else in life are we like, am I only with other 42-year-olds, so.
Well, and you mentioned in your book in the introduction that one of the motivations for not putting your kids in school was seeing how different they were in terms of this kid learned to walk at this age where this kid learned to walk at this age, and it really wasn't very similar. So why would you go to school and expect it to be similar?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. So Molly, my oldest, who I said, taught herself to read at 5, and was probably one of the earlier readers of my proficient readers of my gang. But she didn't walk until she was like 17 months old, when she just ran down the hallway in our house. No kind of baby steps. So the other kids were kind of textbook of taking a few steps and stopping or holding on to something and then gradually moving away from that coffee table or so, something like that. And for her, it was just went from 0 to nothing, all of a sudden running. So I think in your own children, you see such diversity in terms of developmental milestones, particularly in early childhood in terms of physical milestones. And yet you're right, when it comes to education, we seem to hold a different standard. So we say, well, now all kindergartners are expected to read. And increasingly, again, as you both know, it seems that these academic standards are being pushed ever earlier into early childhood, and expecting younger children to do things that even when we were in school wouldn't have been an expectation. And I think that that's really causing a lot of, harm to young people, pushing them before they're developmentally ready. I mean, it's like, again, pushing a child to walk before they're developmentally ready to do that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting. We've heard from others, unschoolers, stories from my own experience. A lot of times in this educational environment, you see a kid go from like 0 to 10, like you say, right? And there's no like sort of middle. For some kids, there are a middle, but you do hear a lot of those 0 to 10 stories. Did you see that in all your kids, or have you seen an intermediate phase? Have you seen like, a middle?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the reading is a good example, because there were kind of different progressions in terms of when they would start to read and how long they might have been in that kind of early reading phase. But as I trace in my book, and as I'm sure you know from interviewing unschoolers, is that once kids hit proficiency, they generally go pretty quickly from that kind of earlier intermediate stage to being able to read anything they want, and having that be really quick. But again, for some kids, that might not be until, they're 10 years old even. And for a lot of families, I think that would be a challenge to be able to wait and trust that a child, again, when you're exposing them to literacy and making sure that they have all of these resources, but to trust that this is sort of a bell curve, right? If we think about reading proficiency, you'll have these early readers. Peter Gregg at Boston College calls them precocious readers that are, learning to read at 4 or 5. And then on the other end, you'll have kids that might not be 10 or 11 before they're reading. And what the research shows, and what I trace in the book, is that 8.5, it typically is the kind of average age of proficiency where a child could read whatever you throw in front of them, essentially, if they're learning to read outside of schooling.
But the 8.5, I'm assuming that the variation on the two sides of the curve are pretty wide. So it's 8.5 as an average, but I'm sure it's pretty spread out. Or do you find that it is pretty concentrated at 8.5?
I think it's right. I mean, this is looking at, kind of academic research around young people learning to read outside of schooling, specifically looking at homeschoolers. And I think they found, again, from what is likely a relatively small sample size of homeschoolers, but they found that the kind of 8.5 is that center. But yeah, there's really wide variation on either end.
Yeah, I think in my study of unschoolers learning to read, it was from, anywhere from 3.5 to like 13. And I teach teachers, and when they hear that number, right, when they hear that some people have naturally learned to read at 10, 11, 12, 13, it strikes fear in their hearts, because it's just not what they've been taught. I think they would probably be able to live with 8.5, right? Sometimes, although, in New York City schools districts, it's more like 5 or 6. But yeah, it's really, really interesting. One of the things I am most impressed by you is that you have always been amazingly knowledgeable about your decisions. You've always been amazingly, you're just like an amazing unschooling parent. And it's my hope that a lot of listeners might be new to this form of learning. And because they're new, might be a little nervous to jump in. So what advice would you give to individuals who are considering this whole, learning by living and this whole unschooling?
Yeah, so two things I think to begin with, or three, I will say. One is to start by reflecting on your own experience in schooling, because I think when we really stop to question schooling as the default, it opens up an opportunity to examine what our own personal experience with schooling was. And I talk in the book about how I learned, really well to play the game of school, to, do what the teacher asked, to regurgitate the information successfully on the test, to be obedient and conform to the expectations of school. And, I think it's really important to look at the young people who, refuse to play that game of school. And I think we can learn so much from those kids that we might consider, the defiant ones or the troublemakers or the ones that just are kind of gazing out the window. They're the ones who I feel like can tell us so much more about what's happening in school. They refuse to play the game. And they recognize that it's a game, or even if they, in their, young souls, don't really understand, there's something about it that they realize just isn't quite right. And so I think it's important to really examine what schooling is and what your own experience is, and then look at your children and see, what is it about them? Or more and more, I hear people say, "Oh, my kid is asking me to be homeschooled," and that to me is a good sign that when young people themselves realize that this is an option, that can be a really powerful force. If nothing else, just to normalize other options beyond schooling. And so I think looking at how your children learn, are they happy? Are they fulfilled at school, or is there, something else that's not going on, that might not be working well for them? And then I feel like the next step after that, or in conjunction with those first two, is to connect with a community. And we're so fortunate now with technology to be able to connect virtually with so many communities. So through Facebook or Yahoo groups or Google groups, local groups of homeschoolers. And I think I always say, just Google your location and homeschooling, and you're likely to find a lot of resources. And you can also visit the Alliance for Self-Directed Education, where of course the three of us are involved. That's at self-directed.org. Which has member forums and can offer support for families who are interested in self-directed education.
I love points 2 and 3. My son has been, he's doing different things now, but he also substitute taught for a while. And one of the things he said to me after he substitute taught his first day was that he said, "I wanted to tell them all the secret," right? And I wanted to tell them all that this was not mandatory, that this is, there are other choices out there.
One of the things to add to one of Kerry's points that I always like to tell people when they talk about the doubts that they understandably have is not only think about your own experience in school, but think about your own experience learning outside of school. Because when we talk about learning, we tend to talk about school learning. So when parents tend to be concerned about how does someone learn this or how does someone learn that? One of the things I always ask them is, well, what do you do when you don't know something? I mean, some people might want a class on it, but some people, most of us go and we figure it out from various resources. And I like to kind of remind people, you don't have to think of kids differently. They may learn the same way.
Yeah, and I think there is so much anxiety or focus on making sure that young people are kind of ticking the boxes in these core academic subjects. And of course, what makes unschooling separate from other versions of homeschooling is we're kind of challenging that whole notion of separating academic knowledge into subject silos, replicating school at home, and so on. We're really trying to disconnect those things. And I love to give the example of Molly, my 13-year-old, who loves martial arts. She and her younger sister do martial arts 3 times a week. And this was something that, again, is sprouted from their own interest. There was a new martial arts studio that opened in our neighborhood. Molly was curious about it, was seeing the video kind of playing in the window as they were kind of finishing construction on this particular studio, and was curious. And asked if she could go in and talked to the person who ran the center and asked if she could do a trial class, and really fell in love with it. And now is about a year away from black belt, very focused and disciplined on this passion of hers. And from that real passion for martial arts, which was based in kind of Korean martial arts, she became interested in the Korean language and culture and history, because many of the forms that she was working on and the weaponry that she was using had Korean names. And so she was learning Korean that way and said, oh, this is really fascinating. I'd love to learn more. And so, she asked us about it, and we found originally some online resources, and she liked that, but wanted something a bit more in depth. And so I put out an email to our, local community listserv to see if anybody, taught Korean, and found a native Korean speaker who now my daughter meets with for 3 times a week at the local library. And she's been doing that for over a year now with the goal of being fluent in Korean. And the key is that it wasn't like we said to her, okay, now it's time for you to learn a foreign language or something like that. It was truly sprouted from her own passion for this extracurricular activity, right? So it's the value of this out of school learning that ultimately leads to real, what we would call academic type of learning, but really leads to enriching, authentic learning in a whole assortment of areas.
So I have one last question. I always think, like, what do you see in 5 years? I always think these questions are so hard. What do you see in the future for both yourself as well as for your children?
I'm very hopeful for the future of educational innovation and out of school learning. I think there's just a real demand that's increasing from parents and from educators and from young people who want more alternatives to conventional schooling. And I think I'm certainly excited by what I'm seeing in terms of innovative K-12 learning models that are sprouting outside of the conventional system, that are really being driven by, in many cases, and in fact, in almost all of the cases I spotlight in my book, by former public school teachers who really are growing increasingly dissatisfied by their work and want a different kind of way of educating. They realize that this isn't why they went into teaching. They want something that's more meaningful and fulfilling for them and for the people that they work with. And they're increasingly building these alternatives to school. And so I'm really hopeful for the future. I think that there's some really great things to come, and we'll see expanded options for more families.
Thank you so much. You've been so amazing to talk to.
Oh, it's been great to be with you. Thanks for having me.